Still time left for the lecture. 1.5 minutes, I guess. G. So, do I start? Host. मैं शुरू करूं बेटा? If your log. Okay. ठीक है. Thank you, my dear. Thank you very much. So I start with the lecture. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. ठीक है? अच्छा जी. So last time when this ended, when the lecture ended, so we were in the middle of doing parathyroids. One quick look at the parathyroids again. आपके functional point of view से बहुत important है because they regulate calcium in the body. So आपको बताया था normally you have 4 parathyroids. They can be less than 4, 2 हो सकते हैं, 3 हो सकते हैं, or they can be more than 4. इसकी normal location तो ये है, the 2 inferior parathyroids are located close to the inferior pole of the thyroid on the posterior surface of the thyroid. So what you see over here is the दिखाया तो बेटा anterior surface हुआ है, लेकिन उन्होंने possibly इनको locate किया हुआ है. This is the posterior surface. This is the correct location. ठीक है? ये जो आपको नजर आ रहा है, this is just the possibility where any wrongly placed parathyroid gland may be present. Aberrant parathyroid gland कहते हैं. ठीक है जी? Superior parathyroids are more constantly positioned. Inferior जो है, they are very variable because when the thymus descends from the third arch into the thorax, in front of the trachea, it drags the parathyroid, inferior parathyroid with it. So location आपको मैंने बताई थी, ये inferior thyroid artery enters over here. This is the thyroid gland. This is the posterior surface. The posterior surface has these 2 parathyroids. ठीक है? So please note that the parathyroid is located in such a way that it is lying between the true capsule and the false capsule. False capsule pre-tracheal fascia से बनी. So it is lying between the 2 capsules. This is approximately the site where the inferior thyroid artery enters. So the superior parathyroid is located 1 centimeter above the entry of inferior thyroid artery, and inferior parathyroid is located approximately 1 centimeter inferior to the entry of the inferior thyroid artery. Arterial supply, since it is located in close vicinity of the inferior thyroid artery, it is normally expected the inferior thyroid artery would give a branch to the superior parathyroid and the inferior parathyroid. Besides that, you may have a branch coming from the thyroid artery. You may have laryngeal, tracheal, and esophageal branches supplying these parathyroid glands. Venous drainage goes into the thyroid venous plexus. Lymphatic drainage deep cervical lymph nodes में होते हैं. At times ये जो paratracheal lymph nodes ये जो पड़े हैं, the lymphatic drainage, some of it may go into the paratracheal lymph nodes. Nerve supply, once again, beta. This gland is an endocrine gland. It is under hormonal control. So nerves coming to this gland do not supply the gland. They are just vasomotor. So nerves cervical sympathetic ganglia से आती हैं, but they only form a plexus around the blood vessels. ये inferior thyroid के ये supply करती है, so they are forming a plexus around the inferior thyroid artery. Gland को की अपनी कोई nerve supply नहीं है. Similarly is the case of thyroid gland. They do not have a nerve supply of its own, because this gland is an endocrine gland and it is under hormonal control. Chale ji, let's start with the new topic, today's topic, and that was root of the neck. Root of the neck, also called superior thoracic aperture. Both are one and the same thing. By the root of the neck or the superior thoracic aperture, I mean those structures in the root of the neck are those structures that enter from the neck and go into the thorax, or reverse, from the thorax they go into the neck. Okay, boundaries आपको पहले भी पता है. I just repeat it. Starting from the posterior aspect, you have the body of first thoracic vertebra, T1 की body. Okay, laterally you have the first rib, inner margin of the first rib, and most anteriorly you have the upper border of the manubrium sterni. ये manubrium है sternum की. This is the upper border. So manubrium sterni, inner border of the first rib, and the body of the first thoracic vertebra, they make up the superior thoracic aperture. Actually, one by one, let's do the structures in the root of the neck, starting with the arteries. The arteries in the root of the neck, brachiocephalic is one of them. Brachiocephalic आप already कर चुके हैं, ठीक है ना? But still, at the cost of repeating myself, the brachiocephalic artery rises from the arch of the aorta. The brachiocephalic artery, the first branch rising from the arch of the aorta, runs in the superior mediastinum, passes it passes behind the sternoclavicular joint. Now this brachiocephalic artery, anteriorly इसके strap muscles पड़े हुए थे. It is covered by strap muscles. ठीक है? And I hope you also appreciate कि अब ये brachiocephalic artery है. This is what I am showing you. ये ठीक है? This is lying behind the manubrium sterni. ये manubrium है बेटा. So the brachiocephalic artery is lying posterior to the manubrium sterni. In other words, manubrium is lying anterior to the brachiocephalic artery. Okay. Now, please note that as it ascends, it goes superiorly and it also moves laterally. Okay. And posterior to this sternoclavicular joint, this sternoclavicular joint, posterior to the sternoclavicular joint, the brachiocephalic trunk, it divides into two terminal branches, namely the right common carotid medially, or the lateral artery here, that is the right subclavian. Before its division into the right common carotid and the right subclavian, the brachiocephalic trunk does not give any name to branches. Okay? So there are no pre-terminal. Pre-terminal branches का मतलब है branches before the termination of the blood vessel. यहाँ पे देख लीजिए, dividing approximately behind the sternoclavicular joint, it divides into right common carotid, right subclavian. Subclavian की बात कर रहे हैं. अब हम common carotid हम already कर चुके हैं. Internal jugular vein we've already done. Now let's come to the right subclavian. Since the right subclavian peaks into the neck, अब ये आपको पता है it supplies the upper, the main artery of the upper limb. उसके अलावा this supplies structures in the neck. Obviously, when it is passing through the neck, it supplies structures in the neck, and then branches from this subclavian artery enter into the skull and supply structures in the brain as well. Okay. आपको पता है the right subclavian, अभी हमने बात की है, the right subclavian arises from the by the division of brachiocephalic trunk. This division occurs posterior to the sternoclavicular joint. On the left side, however, थोड़ा सा different है. ये जो आपकी subclavian है, left subclavian, ये देख लीजिए, ये left subclavian है. This left subclavian arises from the arch of the aorta. This is the third branch of the arch of the aorta. This also passes behind the sternoclavicular joint and enters the thorax. So both the arteries, right and left subclavian, both of them pass behind the sternoclavicular joint and enter into the neck. Continuing with this subclavian, अब आप ये देख लीजिए कि this is the brachiocephalic trunk, common carotid, and this is the terminal, the second terminal branch of the brachiocephalic trunk. Up, please have a look at it, careful look at it. You see this structure, this muscle, a very important muscle, scalenus anterior, attaching to the first rib. Okay? The scalenus anterior. Yeah. Now, this subclavian artery, to begin with, it is passing laterally and it is also ascending. Suprolateral iska hai, and then it passes behind the scalenus anterior muscle, emerges from the lateral border of the the scalenus anterior, and then it passes behind the clavicle. ये तो reverse trip दिखाई हुई है ना बेटा, clavicle यहाँ से उठा remove की हुई है. So it is passing behind the clavicle. किस जगह? About the midpoint of the clavicle, middle of the clavicle, posterior to the middle of the clavicle. This subclavian artery, this leaves the neck and enters into the thorax. Kiss level, sorry, enters into the arm. What level? Outer border of first rib. ये देख लीजिए, subclavian emerging from the lateral, ये scalenus anterior muscle है. Emerging from the lateral border of scalenus anterior, ये देख लीजिए, passing behind the middle of the clavicle, and at the outer border of the first rib, ये first rib है, at the outer border of the first rib, the name of the subclavian artery changes to axillary artery. Now, I hope you appreciate one thing. You have a part of the subclavian artery which is lying medial to the scalenus anterior muscle. Then you have a part of the subclavian artery which is lying behind the scalenus anterior muscle, and then you have a part of the subclavian artery which is lying lateral to the scalenus anterior. So you have three parts. The first part is medial to the scalenus anterior, the second part is posterior to the scalenus anterior, and the third part is lateral to the scalenus anterior. अच्छा, अब यहाँ पे एक चीज और देखिए. This is the first part which is lying medial to the scalenus anterior. Please note that this is first part is lying in front of this structure. ये जो structure है, this is the cervical dome of pleura. Obviously, the cervical dome of pleura is covering the apex of the lung. So posterior to the first part of the subclavian artery, you have the cervical dome of pleura and the lung, and you also have cervical sympathetic trunk lying posterior to the first part. वो यहाँ पे दिखाई नहीं हुई. ठीक है, यहाँ पे उन्होंने सिर्फ the structures passing anterior to the subclavian दिखाया हुआ है, जिनमें vagus nerve है and the Phrenic nerve है. These are the structures which are lying in front of the first part of the subclavian. In fact, they are passing between the subclavian artery, the Phrenic nerve and the vagus nerve, 10th cranial nerve. They are lying between the subclavian artery and subclavian vein. बेटा एक बात याद रख लीजिए, मैं आपके रिलेशंस जो होते हैं इनके, I pen them down कि posteriorly ये है, anteriorly ये है. आपकी किताब में ऐसा नहीं लिया हुआ. I do it for your convenience, but please learn to accept one thing कि अगर if I say okay, this subclavian artery is lying anterior to the pleura, तो उसका मतलब ये है कि the pleura is lying posterior to the subclavian artery. तो ये थोड़ा सा वर्ड्स को ट्विस्ट किया जाता है, बट अपने दिमाग को हाथ से रखिए. अच्छा जी, हम ब्रांचेस की बात कर देते हैं. The subclavian artery gives branches from the first, second and third part. First part से 3 branches, second part से 2 branches होती हैं, basically one single trunk होता है, and third part से you have one branch. This is in sharp contrast to your axillary artery. इसमें बिल्कुल opposite था. ठीक है. First part की branches क्या हैं? The first branch from the first part, the vertebral artery. Second branch, internal thoracic या internal mammary artery. And the third part से thyrocervical trunk rise करती है. यहाँ पे भी दिखा दूँ. As vertebral artery ascending from the superior surface, internal thoracic, internal mammary artery from the inferior surface of the first part, going into the thorax, does not give any artery, does not give any branch in the neck. Internal thoracic की बात कर रहे हैं. ठीक है. Third part ये है. Third part is called thyrocervical trunk. ठीक है. Thyrocervical trunk then gives 2 branches, suprascapular, transverse cervical. You've already done the suprascapular and transverse cervical. Then comes 2 terminal branches. The 2 terminal branches are inferior thyroid artery supplying the thyroid gland, हम in detail ये कर चुके हैं, and also the deep cervical. Okay, ascending cervical. Ascending cervical and inferior thyroid are the 2 terminal branches. इसमें सिर्फ inferior thyroid दिखाई हुई है, ascending cervical इसमें नहीं दिखाई हुई. Please remember the names of these arteries, branches of subclavian arteries. आपको और कुछ भी नहीं अगर पूछे ना तो ये ब्लड वेसल्स के नाम जरूर पूछ लेते हैं. Okay, now let's come to the second part. ये second part की branch है, इसको costocervical trunk कहते हैं. First part से thyrocervical trunk था, second part से costocervical trunk है. ये this gives 2 branches, highest intercostal या supreme intercostal ये, and then you have deep cervical artery. Deep cervical up पढ़ चुके हैं upper limb में. Okay, ये supply करती है in that particular area. Third part यहाँ पे they have shown the third part over here, but they have not shown its branch arising from the third part, and that is dorsal scapular. Okay, so let me go over it once again. Subclavian artery, please remember these branches. These should be on the tips of your fingers. First part, medial to the scalenus anterior. Yeah. First part is medial to the scalenus. ये scalenus anterior muscle है. First part is medial to the scalenus anterior. Second part is posterior to the scalenus anterior. And the third part is lateral to the scalenus anterior. Arising from the first part, you have vertebral artery, the first branch, internal thoracic artery, and then you have thyrocervical trunk. Thyrocervical trunk की यहाँ 2 branches दिखाई हुई हैं, suprascapular and transverse cervical, and then you have the terminal 2 branches, जिसमें you have the inferior thyroid artery, ये देख लीजिए, यहाँ पे ये inferior thyroid artery है, and ascending cervical branch है, उसकी जो कि नहीं दिखाई हुई यहाँ पे. From the second part arises this single costocervical trunk, but this costocervical trunk further divides into 2 branches. It is the highest intercostal artery and the deep cervical, and arising from the third part of the subclavian artery, you have the dorsal scapular artery. उसका नाम बता रहे हैं. It goes in, supplies, takes part in the formation of arterial circle around the scapula. इसकी बात कर लेते हैं vertebral की, important है. It's a very important artery because this is the artery that supplies structures in the neck and also structures inside the skull and the brain. Okay, cervical part. This is the cervical part that runs in the neck. This cervical part actually runs in a pyramidal space. ये जो pyramidal space है, this, before I go any further, this muscle is the scalenus anterior. This is the longus colli, and above this is the longus capitis. So this is the longus capitis, this is the longus colli, and this is the scalenus anterior muscle. So there is this triangular or pyramidal area formed between the medial border of the scalenus anterior and between the longus colli and longus capitis. So this space formed between the scalenus anterior, longus colli, and longus capitis, and obviously the first rib. So this triangular space, this lodges the vertebral artery. Okay? At the apex of this space, ये vertebral artery है. इसको काटा हुआ, this is the other cut end of the vertebral artery. At the apex of this space, the vertebral artery leaves this part of the neck. लेकिन it still remains in the neck. लेकिन at a different side. अब कहाँ जाती है vertebral artery? At the level of 6 cervical vertebra. The vertebral artery enters into the foramen present in the transverse process of the cervical vertebra. If you remember, cervical vertebra के transverse processes में every cervical vertebra, first say 6th, not the 7th. From cervical vertebra 1 to cervical vertebra 6, the transverse processes have foramen in them. They are called foramen transversarium. ये देख लीजिए. This vertebral artery, as it descends and leaves through this pyramidal space, it enters the foramen transversarium of the 6 cervical vertebrae. And 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and the 1st. First cervical vertebra, this is the body of the first cervical vertebra. This is the transverse process with foramen transversarium lodging the vertebral artery. And this is the posterior arch of the first cervical vertebra. First cervical vertebra को atlas भी कहते हैं, ठीक है? Because it holds the head on it. Those who have read Greek mythology, अगर उनको याद हो तो उनका जो एक figure था, एक hypothetical था, myth उनकी जो थी, Atlas was a very strong person in Greek mythology that was holding the head, the world on its head. So इसलिए इसका नाम Atlas रख दिया, because it is holding the skull on its and the brain on its top. So this is the posterior arch of the Atlas. Posterior arch of the Atlas के ऊपर एक groove होता है, and the vertebral artery, as it emerges from the foramen transversarium of the first cervical vertebrae, it then passes posteriorly and runs in the groove present on the posterior arch of the first cervical vertebrae, that is the posterior arch of the Atlas vertebrae. Then from this groove, the 2 vertebral arteries, one on either side, they enter in the skull through the foramen magnum. बेटा यहाँ तक समझ आई है? So from 139 students, we go down to 126 students. Fine. That's okay. Are there any questions so far? जी बेटा बताइए क्या क्वेश्चन है? अच्छा समझ आ गई है? ओके फाइन, आगे चलते हैं. Up, let's come to the part of the vertebral artery which is lying inside the skull. आपको भी बताया कि the two vertebral arteries, one on right and left, they enter the skull through the foramen magnum. When they enter the skull, they run on either side. Yes, spinal cord है. This is the medulla. This structure is the pons. ये आप physiology में पढ़ चुके हैं. This is the pons. और ये this part is the midbrain. ठीक है? So medulla, this is the pons. ये fifth cranial nerve है, trigeminal, emerging from the surface of the pons. ये देख लीजिए, trigeminal की 3 branches. बहुत अच्छी drawing है. ठीक है? This is not taken from your book. ये नेट पे से ली गई है. अब ये vertebral artery आप देख लीजिए कि since it is running on either side of the spinal cord and then the medulla, ये spinal cord को भी, this is the cerebellum. ये cerebellum है, इस side का cerebellum has been removed. So it is running between the medulla and the cerebellum. It will supply the medulla. It will supply the cerebellum. It will also, some branches will go to the spinal cord because spinal cord continues superiorly with the medulla. So it gives branches to the spinal cord, the vertebral artery. I'm talking about this green artery. It gives branches, sorry, I'm so sorry. It gives branches to the spinal cord. It gives branches to the medulla. It gives branches to the cerebellum. And don't forget, this entire structure, the brain is covered by meninges. Okay? So this vertebral artery also gives branches to the dura mater in the posterior cranial fossa because all this structure, all this is lying in the posterior cranial fossa. Cerebellum, posterior cranial fossa, you know that. Now the two vertebral arteries join each other at the junction between the pons and between the medulla and the pons. So pons or medulla के junction पे the two vertebral arteries join each other and they make up the basilar artery. Basilar artery runs on the surface of the pons. Okay, and this basilar artery then takes part in the formation of this arterial circle that supplies the brain. Is this clear? बस आप ये याद रख लीजिए कि the two vertebral arteries they join together at the lower border of the pons, या upper border of medulla कह लें, या the junction between the pons and medulla कह लें, एक ही बात है. ठीक है? So it then forms the basilar artery. That is where we, I think, should wind up the vertebral artery. Coming to the internal thoracic, also called the internal mammary artery. This artery arises from the inferior surface of subclavian first part. It gives no branches in the neck and runs downwards and medially and enters the thorax. Okay? वहाँ पे जो supply है, you already are well aware of it. Okay, let's come to the veins in the root of the neck. दो ही main veins हैं in the root of the neck. External jugular vein, this one, आप कर चुके हो. उसकी formation, इसकी termination आप कर चुके हो. Running on the surface of the sternomastoid, ending in the, I'm talking about the external jugular. यहाँ से, I mean, running on the surface of the sternomastoid and ultimately ending over here. Subclavian vein. ठीक है? Okay, ये जो आपको नजर आ रही है, this thick vein, this is the internal jugular. Let's come to this particular vein today that we are going to study. ये जो vein close to the midline. This vein is the anterior jugular vein, which is lying in the subcutaneous tissue. या फिर also may be lying deep to the investing layer of deep cervical fascia. ये इसकी location है. So one has to be very careful when dividing the skin and subcutaneous tissue and investing layer of deep cervical fascia because if this vein is not ligated, इसको बांध ना दिया जाए तो it becomes a source of bleeding. ठीक है, अब ये बनती कैसी है? This is the hyoid bone. Above the hyoid bone, this is the submental area. This is the submandibular gland. So veins on the superficial surface of the submandibular gland plus some veins from the submental area together, they join together and make up these veins. Anterior jugular vein. Okay. Now, please note it is close to the midline. ये midline है, so it is running on either side of the midline, but it is running medial to the anterior border. Yes, sternomastoid का interior border है. So it is running medial to the anterior border of the sternomastoid. At the lower part of the neck, ये जो anterior jugular on either side, they run past behind the sternomastoid. ये sternomastoid है in the lower part of the neck. The anterior jugular vein runs behind the posterior to the sternomastoid. This anterior jugular vein then ends in the external jugular vein over here. External jugular में भी कर सकता है and or it may end in the subclavian. दोनों में से किसी में. Over here it is joining the subclavian, but it could end up in the external jugular vein. Both are correct. Okay. Now, one thing what one has to remember is that the two anterior jugular veins, they join each other immediately above the manubrium. ये clavicles है ना बेटा? So this area would be the manubrium. Immediately above the manubrium, the two anterior jugular veins, they join each other and form this vein, which is called jugular venous arch. Jugular venous arch. Any questions so far, beta? Right? Okay. Let's go on to the next vein, which is the subclavian vein. Subclavian vein. अब opposite direction में चलना है. Subclavian artery तो हमने कहा था ना, outer border of first rib पे, it becomes the axillary. This is the opposite. The subclavian vein is formed by the continuation of the axillary vein at the outer border of the first rib. ये first rib है. At the outer border of the first rib, the axillary vein changes its name to subclavian vein. Okay? It terminates by joining the internal jugular vein to form the brachiocephalic vein. ये देख लीजिए. Subclavian vein, internal jugular vein, and the two join together to form the brachiocephalic vein. दोनों sides. अच्छा जी. Now, please note one thing कि ये जो subclavian vein है, this runs parallel to the subclavian artery, but the two are separated from each other by the attachment, lower attachment of this muscle, which is the scalus anterior. So the scalus anterior muscle separates the subclavian vein from the subclavian artery. The subclavian vein is lying anteriorly, the subclavian artery is lying posterior to the muscle. इसकी subclavian vein की you have one tributary, and that is the external jugular vein. Okay. Before we go on to the nerves that are present in the root of the neck, because these will be the last structures. Are you with me? Do you have any questions? Do you have any questions, Peter? समझ आ गया सारा कुछ? Okay, क्योंकि some of it was mere repetition, but it needed to be done. Anyway, You have three nerves present in the root of the neck, three main nerves that need to be discussed. From medial to lateral, you have the sympathetic trunk, then comes the 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve, and still laterally running on the surface of the sternocleidomastoid is the Phrenic nerve. Sorry, sternocleidomastoid nahi hai beta, this is the scalenus anterior muscle. I don't know why I keep on calling it sternomastoid. This is the scalenus anterior muscle, and the Phrenic nerve runs on the surface of the scalenus anterior muscle. ठीक है, बाकी दोनों nerves they are lying medial to the scalenus anterior. Okay, let's discuss these nerves one by one. ये जो vagus nerve है बेटा, जब cranial nerves करवाएंगे आपको, we'll repeat it once again. अब आपकी cranial nerves में से 8th nerve रहेगी, that I'll do with the ear. 9th, 10th, 11th वो रह गई हैं. 12th cranial nerve will be done with the tongue. इससे पहले की सब nerves हम कर चुके हैं. First cranial nerve I'll do with the nose. Second हम कर चुके हैं. Third, fourth, sixth eye के साथ हो गई थी. Fifth, trigeminal, that was the first nerve that we covered. 7th nerve, facial, हम वो भी कर चुके हैं. ठीक है. So 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th जो रह गई हैं, वो इंशाल्लाह in the coming weeks we will cover them, and that will complete all your cranial nerves. Cranial nerves का जो separate chapter है, उसमें से ये nerves kindly पढ़ते रहिए, because आप ये expect अब नहीं करेंगे कि वो chapter as a chapter cover किया जाएगा. हम उसको साथ साथ cover कर रहे हैं as the need goes by. Okay. इस सिलसिले में do we have any questions? Cranial nerves या syllabus etc. के बारे में any questions? नहीं है. Okay. So let's start with the vagus nerve. Now the vagus nerve emerges from the jugular foramen. Yeah. This is the jugular foramen. This over here is supposed to be the jugular foramen. So the 10th cranial nerve, ये जो middle में है, this comes out of the jugular foramen and enters into the carotid sheath. क्योंकि मैंने आपको बताया था, the carotid sheath was attached around the jugular foramen and the carotid canal. ये सारा जो है, ये carotid sheath इसके give attached. So the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, as soon as it comes out of the jugular foramen, it enters into the carotid sheath. Okay? In the carotid sheath, it is the most posterior of the structures. Carotid sheath के contents हम करते हैं, तो उसकी structures की location is very important to get a question over it. Laterally, internal jugular vein होती है. Medially, common carotid artery होती है. And in the groove between the internal jugular vein laterally, common carotid medially, lying in a posterior plane. Posteriorly is located the 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve. So please remember, the vagus nerve is lying posteriorly in the carotid, inside the carotid sheath. Okay? One by one, ये देख लीजिए, right side की 10th cranial nerve है, और ये left side की 10th cranial nerve है. Left side में आप देख लीजिए, the 10th cranial nerve is running between these two arteries. ये common carotid है, ये subclavian है. दोनों arch of aorta से arise कर रही हैं. And the 10th cranial nerve is running between the internal carotid and common carotid and subclavian. Now this nerve passes in front of the arch of aorta. मैं left side की बात कर रही हूँ. And for doing so, it passes behind the brachiocephalic vein, left side, and it also passes behind the sternoclavicular joint. So lying anterior to the 10th cranial nerve is the sternoclavicular joint. but before that it's also the Brachiocephalic Vein. Okay? And then of course it enters the thorax where it is lying anterior to the arch of aorta. Okay, right side पे आ जाते हैं. Let's talk about this particular. Please note that this nerve is lying in front of the first part of subclavian. ये subclavian है. Artery की बात कर रहे हैं. It is lying in front of the first part of the subclavian. So दूसरे लफ्जों में ये कि the subclavian artery, first part of the subclavian artery is lying behind the 10th cranial nerve on the right side. And lying in front of the 10th cranial nerve, you have this brachiocephalic vein. So दोनों sides पे one thing is common. The brachiocephalic veins are lying in front of these nerves, plus still anteriorly you have the sternoclavicular joint lying in front of this brachiocephalic vein. Okay, and then of course it enters the cortex. यहाँ तक ठीक है? ये रिलेशंस थोड़े से आपको याद रखने होंगे, बस बात चीजें इसमें बहुत जरूरी होती हैं. They need to be dealt with. Okay, so before we end, let's talk about the very important nerves, the recurrent laryngeal nerve. हमने partly ये हम discuss की है when we were doing the thyroid gland. Let's do them as branches of vagus nerve. Please remember the recurrent laryngeal nerves. एक तो ये कि देख लीजिए recurrent laryngeal. Recurrent का मतलब it goes back. ठीक है? Laryngeal का मतलब is something to do with the larynx. So it supplies the muscles of the larynx. All the muscles of the larynx except cricothyroid. Just one muscle जो है cricothyroid वो नहीं supply होता recurrent laryngeal से. The rest all are supplied by recurrent laryngeal nerve. So दो बातें याद कर लीजिए. एक तो ये it goes back, recurrent है. दूसरा ये कि it supplies the muscles of the larynx. If you remember these two, ये इनका नाम आपको बता रहा है. इतना भी आप लिख दें, इतना भी याद रख लें तो कम से कम आपको कुछ मार्क तो मिल ही जाएगा. I mean, one tends to forget better. When there are so many relations, obviously one tends to forget the supply क्या है. So इसीलिए the good thing is कि they have named the nerves according to the functions or according to their location. So let's talk about the recurrent laryngeal nerve. The recurrent laryngeal nerves on both the sides arise in the lower part of the neck. Okay? They arise from the 10th cranial nerve. ये 10th cranial nerve है on this side. This is the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve on the left side. पहले left side की बात कर लेते हैं. Cursor इस वक्त left side पे है. In the lower part of the neck, the recurrent laryngeal nerve. In fact, recurrent laryngeal nerve on the left side is given off in the thorax. See? It arches around the arch of aorta. वैसे कहते ये हैं कि ये जो आपका है ligamentum arteriosus, ductus arteriosus, ये उसके गिर्द arch करती है. बहरहाल for you people, if you remember, okay, it arches around the arch of aorta. ठीक है? किस लेवल पे ये लूप कर रही है या हुक कर रही है around the arch of aorta? That level is 10th or 4th or 5th thoracic vertebra. So T4 के level पे the recurrent laryngeal nerve hooks around the arch of aorta on the left side. Right side पे थोड़ा सा different है. Right side पे the vagus nerve gives off the recurrent laryngeal nerve in the neck, in the lower part of the neck. ठीक है? This recurrent laryngeal nerve then loops around or hooks around the subclavian, first part of the subclavian artery. With extension, it is doing that. Okay. Now, in both the cases, once they loop around, once they hook around the blood vessels, their own blood vessels, right side पे subclavian, left side पे arch of aorta. After hooking around these two arteries, the two recurrent laryngeal nerves then pass in the groove between the trachea and esophagus. ये esophagus है, ये trachea है. देख लीजिए दोनों sides पे the recurrent laryngeal nerve is lying in the groove between trachea and esophagus. So tracheoesophageal groove में ये पड़ी हुई होती है. This is extremely important because that is the point where you locate the recurrent laryngeal nerve. अगर आपको नाम मिल रही हो तो यहाँ देख लीजिए. This is important because thyroid surgery में you have to find this nerve. You have to make sure you preserve it. You must not damage. क्यों नहीं damage करना? Because it supplies all the muscles of the larynx except one muscle which is parathyroid. Plus trachea को भी देती है branches, esophagus को भी देती है branches. So this nerve is extremely important. और हमने इसका एक और भी किया था कि this nerve अब exactly यहाँ तो नहीं है, थोड़े से फासले पे है. So this nerve and its relationship with the inferior thyroid artery वो हम already कर चुके हैं, वो यहाँ दिखाया नहीं हुआ. ठीक है? So it is called recurrent because it arises and then it loops around and goes back. Up here is the larynx. It supplies the larynx over here. So it is recurrent. It is looping and going back. Inferior thyroid artery का relations मैं repeat करते हूँ उसको. That relation showed that the recurrent laryngeal nerve was lying either in front of the branches of inferior thyroid artery, or it was lying posterior to the branches of inferior thyroid artery, or it may even be present going in between the branches of the inferior thyroid artery. So that is why we ligate the inferior thyroid artery as far away from the gland as possible in order to prevent this particular nerve, because this particular nerve supplies all the muscles of the larynx. अब आ जाते हैं जी phrenic पे. Phrenic nerve, the sole motor supply to the diaphragm. Sensory भी है. It also gives sensory branches to the diaphragm, but it is the sole motor supply of the diaphragm. And let's see phrenic nerve in this here. कौन सी है? Phrenic nerve ये है. This is the phrenic nerve running on the anterior surface of the scalenus anterior, going from lateral side to the medial side. बाकी सब जो branches होती हैं, nerves होती हैं, they run in the neck. They run from medial to lateral. ये देख लीजिए cords of brachial plexus. Medially rise कर रहे हैं, they are going laterally. ये भी 10th cranial nerve की इधर ही जाएगी. But this is the only nerve that crosses the anterior surface of the scalenus anterior. ठीक है? अब इसकी main जो fibers जो that contribute to the formation of phrenic nerve, they come from fourth cervical segment of the spinal cord. So C4 से main fibers आते हैं, but they also receive contribution from C3 and C5. ठीक है? So ये cervical plexus की जो nerves हैं, उसमें से 3, 4, 5 से है जो phrenic nerve बनाता है. अच्छा, sorry. Both nerves, vagus and phrenic, are anterior to the scalenus anterior. ये देख लीजिए. You are right, बेटा. You are very right. ये देख लीजिए. मैं इसी चीज को repeat highlight कर देती हूँ. Scalenus anterior, ये subclavian artery, ये subclavian vein है. ठीक है? So the phrenic nerve is running on the anterior surface of scalenus anterior. The vagus nerve in its upper part also crosses in front of the scalenus anterior, and both these nerves cross the subclavian artery. Right side पे हम बात कर रहे हैं, and Now they are lying between the subclavian artery and subclavian vein. ये आपकी बात बिल्कुल ठीक थी. अच्छा, और पूछ लीजिए. Okay. Thank you, Bera Beta. I hope I'm making myself clear. I hope it's not too much of a mess. God bless you. Thank you for asking this question. ठीक है. So C3, 4, 5 से बनी ये phrenic nerve और आपको बताया runs on the surface of the anterior surface of the scaleless anterior. Okay. अब obviously दूसरे लफ्जों में अगर मैं कहूँ तो the scaleless anterior is lying posterior to the nerve. अब मैं सिर्फ बात को ट्विस्ट कर रही हूँ, इसलिए ट्विस्ट कर रही हूँ बेटा कि आपके एमसीक्यूज में इसी तरह यहाँ पे जो वर्डिंग बुक में दी होती है ना उसको थोड़ा सा हम चेंज कर देते हैं. अगर आपकी किताब में आई डोंट रिमेम्बर आपकी किताब में क्या दी हुई बनाया सारी प्रेजेंटेशन, आई हैव टेकन इट फ्रॉम योर बुक एवरी वर्ड ऑफ इट, बट थोड़ा सा मैंने इसको रिफ्रेज कर दिया, ट्विस्ट नहीं किया, एग्जैक्टली रिफ्रेज कर दिया. सो से फॉर एग्जांपल अगर आपकी किताब में ये दिया हुआ था the phrenic nerve is running anterior to the scaleless anterior, then I will write it. Okay, the scaleless anterior is lying posterior to the phrenic nerve in the neck. It is one and the same thing. ठीक है ना बेटा? अच्छा, अब इसके anteriorly क्या पड़ा होगा? ये देख लीजिए. When this comes down, internal jugular vein होगी इसके आगे. You also have over here, you have this sternocleidomastoid muscle जो यहाँ पे आके attach होगा. So the nerve is also lying posterior to the sternocleidomastoid. ठीक है? And one thing, please remember one thing. Okay, all this is covered by prevertebral fascia. Even your brachial plexus, etc. This is covered by prevertebral fascia. So all these structures are posterior to the prevertebral fascia. So the prevertebral fascia is lying anterior to the phrenic nerve, the vagus nerve, etc. And then the phrenic nerve enters into the thorax. Thorax may course up. You're familiar with this. Now one last thing, and that is the cervical sympathetic trunk. ये भी आप already कर चुके होंगे. But since I'm going to stress on the ganglia. Cervical sympathetic trunk arises from the base of the skull. ठीक है? Starts from the base of the skull. It has three important ganglia: the superior ganglion, the middle ganglion, which is the smallest of the three ganglia, and then comes the inferior ganglion. Three ganglia: superior, middle, and inferior. ये जो cervical sympathetic ganglia है, if you remember, तो जो आपके thoracic fibers थे, sympathetic fibers, they relayed in these ganglia. Upper thoracic presynaptic fibers ये इसमें relate किए. अब postsynaptic कहाँ जाते हैं? We'll do them one by one. Let's start with the inferior ganglia because this is a very important ganglion. The inferior ganglion joins the first thoracic ganglia. So the T1 का जो ganglion है, sympathetic trunk की बात कर रहे हैं. Sympathetic trunk is ganglionated. That means it has multiple ganglia. So it has 12 thoracic ganglia. लेकिन ये जो cervical ganglia है ना, they join each other. Okay, so thoracic is first and inferior cervical ganglia. They join together and they make up cervicothoracic ganglion, also called the stellate ganglion. It is lying above the first rib है बेटा. It is lying on the neck of the first rib. ठीक है जी. अच्छा, ये जो vertebral artery है ना, इसके पीछे पड़ा हुआ होता है. So the vertebral artery is running anterior to the inferior cervical ganglion या stellate ganglion formed by the union of inferior cervical and first thoracic ganglion. दूसरे लफ्जों में ये कि the stellate ganglion is lying posterior to the vertebral artery. मैं आपको हर तरह से रिफ्रेश करके बात बता रही हूँ. ठीक है। अब इसके जो पोस्ट साइनेप्टिक फाइबर्स, सिंपैथेटिक है ना, फाइबर्स ने रिले किया यहाँ पे आके, जो पोस्ट साइनेप्टिक या पोस्ट गैंग्लियोनिक फाइबर्स जो यहाँ से अराइज करेंगे, जो C7-8 के फाइबर्स हैं, दे रन विद द ब्रेकियल प्लेक्सस। ये कंपनी द स्पाइनल नर्व्स, दे रन विद द ब्रेकियल प्लेक्सस। बेटा ब्रेकियल प्लेक्सस में रन करने का मतलब ये नहीं है कि ये मसल्स को सप्लाई करेंगे। सिंपैथेटिक आपको पता है सूडोमोटर, मोटर, बेसोमोटर, पाइलोमोटर होता है। So they are basically nerves for the supply of blood vessels in the region of the upper limb. वो areas जो C7 और C8 spinal nerves से supply होते हैं। उसके अलावा it also contributes to inferior cardiac nerves जो कि हार्ट को वो सप्लाई करते हैं। They make up the help in the formation of cardiac plexus, deep cardiac plexus की formation में। Okay. And then of course periarterial plexus. It is lying in close to the vertebral artery. Vertebral artery is running anterior to it. So sympathetic fibers form a plexus around the vertebral artery, and then okay. Do I make myself clear? Right. 105 left. Let's see कि by the end कितने रह जाते हैं। अच्छा जी, मिडल सर्वाइकल गैंग्लियन, द स्मॉलेस्ट ऑफ द गैंग्लिया। आपको पहले उसमें भी दिखाया था, इधर भी दिखा रहे हैं मिडल सर्वाइकल गैंग्लियन। प्लीज नोट द मिडल सर्वाइकल गैंग्लियन इज lying anterior to the middle thyroid artery। ठीक है, सो उसके posteriorly middle thyroid artery पर सॉरी inferior thyroid, middle thyroid artery होती ही नहीं है, middle thyroid vein होती है। I'm sorry, inferior thyroid artery की बात कर रहे हैं। It is lying anterior to the inferior thyroid artery. In other words, the inferior thyroid artery is lying posterior to the middle cervical ganglion. अब इसका लेवल क्या है? This ganglion is lying at the level of cricoid cartilage, या फिर in other words 6 cervical vertebra उसके transverse process के लेवल पे होता है। At this level, इसका ये मतलब नहीं कि उसकी vicinity में पड़ा हुआ है, ये लेवल है इसका। ओके, अब इसके जो पोस्ट गैंग्लियोनिक फाइबर्स हैं वो मिडिल सर्वाइकल कार्डिक नर्व्स बनाती हैं, प्लस इट फॉर्म्स। अब पेरियार्टेरियल प्लेक्सस कहाँ बनेगा? ब्लड वेसल्स के ऊपर जो प्लेक्सस बनाते हैं ये गैंग्लिया के फाइबर्स, इट विल फॉर्म ऑन व्हिच आर्टरी? inferior thyroid। ये देख लें, since it is lying anterior to the inferior thyroid artery, so it will give branches that form a plexus on the periarterial plexus on the inferior thyroid artery। ठीक है, और कार्डिक नर्व्स बनाते हैं जो 5-6 जो ग्रे रेमाए होते हैं उनसे कार्डिक नर्व्स बनाते हैं। The highest of the ganglia, sympathetic, superior sympathetic, cervical sympathetic ganglia। ये T1 cervical फर्स्ट एंड सेकंड सर्वाइकल वर्टिब्रा के लेवल पे पड़ा होता है, एटलस और एक्सिस के लेवल पे पड़ा होता है। फर्स्ट इज एटलस, सेकंड इज एक्सिस वर्टिब्रा, सो उस लेवल पे ये पड़ा हुआ होता है। और इसके जो फाइबर्स हैं, अब ये हाईएस्ट है, सो इसके फाइबर्स जो हैं दे फॉर्म पेरियार्टेरियल प्लेक्सस। अब इस लेवल पे यू हैव इंटरनल कैरोटिड आर्टरी, क्योंकि उसने बेस ऑफ स्कल के कॉर्मन carotid canal में से enter करना है skull में, so it forms a plexus around the internal carotid. It even forms plexus around branches of the external carotid. Obviously middle meningeal ने enter करना है, accessory meningeal ने base of skull तक जाना है, maxillary नहीं जाना है, so it forms around plexus around branches of external carotid arteries. Plus जो upper 4 cervical nerves जो हैं C1, 2, 3, 4, उनको ये उनके रेमाए जो है इन सर्वाइकल नर्व्स के साथ ट्रैवल करते हैं एंड आल्सो contributes to the formation of cardiac plexus. I think this is the last slide. Yes, it is. So, any questions? Anything you want me to repeat? G. So it is yes, ma'am. That means that you have understood everything. That finishes with the syllabus of the fourth substage. this, whatever. Okay? If there's anything you want me to repeat, anything that you have understood from what I have taught you, please don't hesitate to ask me a question tomorrow. Tomorrow we have a class in embryology. Okay? If you have not understood anything from what Dr. Fatma has taught you, so Monday ko she will take a revision class. Please ask her questions in that revision class. Monday ko afternoon ko main bhi class lungi. So you're more than welcome to ask me questions in that class. If there is anything you want me to repeat from what I have taught you, जो मैंने पढ़ाया है उसमें से आप अगर कुछ और आप चाहते हैं कि वो मैं लेक्चर रिपीट कर दूं या उसमें से कुछ रिपीट कर दूं, तो मंडे को आफ्टरनून की जो क्लास है 1 से 2 वाली, आप प्लीज उसमें मुझे बता दीजिएगा, मैं वो रिपीट कर दूंगी। लेकिन आप मुझे कल बताइए कि आपको कौन सा टॉपिक चाहिए रिपीट करने के लिए। ठीक है? नो क्वेश्चंस? फाइन। सो इट इज 1 o'clock। जुमा मुबारक हो, जाके जुमे की नमाज पढ़िए आप लोग। As it is, I think 103 students are left. Fine, let's stop share. Khuda Hafiz, see you tomorrow morning, inshallah.